Hey, this is Joshua Hardisty, MVA Studio. I am at MCAD right now. And what I want to talk about today is feedback that you might get on your work, and how to sort of understand and approach that feedback, and then what to do with it. So the reason that this is so on my mind, well, it's on my mind all the time because I teach and I'm constantly giving feedback. But I just spent the last couple nights sitting in on mid-program reviews at MCAD's post-bac program. So what happens is students come up, they show 3 or 4 projects that they've done over the last year, and then we're in a 2-year program, and then a panel of professionals gives them feedback on everything from the concepts, the execution, to the presentation itself. So what's interesting to me is that there was a couple of times where it became really clear to me how you need to have a kind of toolkit for dealing with feedback. You cannot just run through life making work and then changing it based on whatever someone else with more status tells you to do. So like in this instance, you're a student, you've done this work, and then 3 professionals come in. They've been invited in by the school, they have status in that instance, and they're sort of respected professionals. You don't just change your work because they have constructive criticism or feedback for you. You've got to absorb that feedback and change it for the right reasons. So how should you approach feedback? Well, the first thing that you need to realize is that feedback or a critique, no matter what that person says, it is not a judgment on your work. They might think it's a judgment on your work, but you can't treat it like it's a judgment on your work. What you need to do is treat the feedback as data that tells you how your work affects a certain person or a certain type of person. This is vastly different than taking everyone's opinion sort of seriously. Like, you should listen to feedback, especially when you have the opportunity to get feedback from somebody that does have more experience, more knowledge, more connections, better work than you, whatever that might be. But even if they tell you your work sucks, they're saying, based on the experiences I have and my understanding of the world, your work sucks. So let me get into the actual reasons why I think you need to really be sort of cautious about how you deal with and integrate feedback. So one of the projects that was really interesting was a student had taken the Brothers Grimm stories and reimagined them. Basically said, like, what if these happened in a different media form? Like, what if they came out of a newspaper? And so she had basically rewritten them as sort of sensational newspaper stories. She created advertising that sort of played off some of these stories or that resonated with it. And then she designed it in such a way that had this kind of like old-timey Victorian newspaper vibe. And for me, as someone who's kind of like half in the professional world and half in academia, and who has an interest in graphic design as kind of a liberal art, or maybe just graphic design as kind of an art form that can generate a self-contained kind of autonomous project that exists only to explore storytelling and communications or something like that. For me, this project makes total sense, and it can be sort of done as is, and is a worthwhile endeavor. Now the panel was made up of 3 branding professionals, and so they're designers and art directors who work more on the marketing, advertising, and branding side of things. But what was interesting is they sort of unanimously liked the newspaper project, but they couldn't relate to it in a way where it made a lot of sense to them. And so this is like one of the first lessons about getting feedback. When you show your work, everyone is always trying to slot it into a space that makes sense to them. So if you think about it, like a portfolio review, most of the time is basically a job interview for a job that might not be available, that you didn't necessarily know you were applying for. So for example, if you have a portfolio review with me, you show me a project, the whole time, I try not to do this, but I totally do it. I'm trying to slot it into like, okay, how can I use this? Like, how is this gonna make sense for me? And that's why Like if somebody shows a typeface design, 9 times out of 10 my eyes glaze over, because like I've got typefaces, I like them. I'm never gonna hire a designer to design a typeface. I shouldn't say never. It's yet to come up. I've yet to encounter a project where I thought, oh, you know what I need to do is design a typeface. So it's like, it doesn't relate to my world. All I can do is go like, oh, cool, you're in. If it's a good typeface, I guess you're ambitious. But it's like, I've got the typefaces I need and I don't design them and I don't run a type foundry. So the typefaces that a student creates, that they're not relatable to me. They just don't matter. It's the same as when I see portfolios that are kind of like heavy on patterny design that's not sort of communications related. It's cool, but doesn't relate to my world, and because it doesn't relate to my world, and because it's not a passion of mine, I have no real feedback on it. Like literally all I go is like, okay, cool, nice pattern. So when the students show this newspaper to these branding professionals, they don't have the same view that I have of like a strange sort of semi-autonomous project that can just be its own thing without being part of a larger project. So while they all liked it, to make it relatable, the suggestions were always, like maybe this could be a marketing kind of lead-in for a reissue of a book or for a movie or something like that. So to make it relatable, it had to become a marketing project. Now, what's interesting is that's not a bad thing at all. Like, I have no objection to that line of reasoning, especially when you've 3 people who work in branding for different amounts of time, and they all have that kind of same feedback. But what could happen, and the student totally wouldn't be blamed for this, is that she could look at that and go like, okay, I've showed this project, these 3 people all had the same feedback. Obviously, I should do that. Obviously, I'm wrong about the angle that I have on this. And that's where my problem would be. Because the thing that needs to be looked at is, okay, you have this super valuable feedback now. You know that when you put this project in front of a branding professional, it does not make sense to them. It's not relatable. They can't slot it into their world and see a use for you as a designer. So you have sort of 2 choices with that. Do you change the project so that it is relatable to that world, which is a totally acceptable thing to do? I don't care about some idea of like artistic compromise. Or do you keep the project as is and you don't show it to that kind of person in a job interview, portfolio review context? Those are both totally reasonable things, but you have to have an understanding of like, where did this data come from, and like how can I use it? Is it relevant? Now the other thing is like, if you straight up don't plan on working in branding and you don't feel the need to have portfolio pieces that are kind of like a contingency plan towards that, well then yeah, like don't change a thing and you're fine. So it's like, it's really critical when you're getting feedback, good or bad, to understand how is your work fitting into the world of the person who's giving you the feedback. And so the second story that really brought this home for me was a student had this book project. Such a good idea, that all these handmade kind of paper sculpture illustrations that were beautiful. But the book itself was terribly designed. It was like very kind of student-y. It felt rushed, and it was disappointing because the illustrations were so good, and then the design just fell so flat. Now, what was interesting is that the 3 branding people didn't really have any critique of the book. They just thought it was great. They could imagine it on their bookshelf. They loved the illustrations. Somebody kind of had a problem with the typeface, but the designer gave their reasoning. And then they were like, okay, cool. Whereas like when I heard the designer's reasoning, that didn't sway me at all. It still didn't feel right. It still didn't feel done. And it was super disappointing because the illustrations were great. And again, what was interesting to me is that the same branding professionals are going to tear apart a project that's directly in their kind of world. So you show like a campaign for a project, and they're gonna have feedback, like technical feedback, conceptual feedback, about a billboard, about something that is digital and a billboard, and whatever, like internal communications for like an exhibition or something. They're gonna have tons of feedback on that. But with the book, they didn't have a lot of feedback. they don't hire designers to design books, and they don't design books themselves. So when they see a book, if it's got content they're excited about, it's relatable in that they go like, oh, this would be a really cool book. I could see this on my bookshelf. They don't think, this is a great idea for a book, but I can't hire you to design a book based off this because it's like not up to snuff. So when I'm looking at it, I'm seeing it through a totally different frame. I design books, I've hired designers to design books, and I have a lot of domain knowledge about it. So when I look at it, my frame of reference is totally different. I'm interested in the concept, but it's not the be-all, end-all. And what I'm really interested in is like, is this a compelling book that's gonna really stand up? So it was an ambitious book, but it wasn't a done book, and it wasn't a compelling book yet. And the point is not to say, okay, well, I'm right and they're wrong because I'm the book designer. But the point is to go like, again, to let go of your sort of ego and go like, well, the book's obviously good because those 3 people liked it. And my argument would be like, okay, appraise where everyone is coming from and make your decision based on that, and make your decision based on the kind of work you're gonna look for. If you're never gonna actually try to get freelance book design work, and the only people that are gonna ever see this are branding professionals without domain knowledge of book design, then you're kind of home free. If you wanna leave it as is, strategically, you can do that. Do I think you should do that? Out of a basic sense of craft, I'd say no, but you got other projects to do. So it's totally reasonable to be like, yeah, if I wanted to be a book designer, I'd redesign it, but I don't really want to be a book designer, so I'm good. But the only way you can make those decisions is to analyze where everyone is coming from, and to look at like, where are they coming from and where are you trying to go? That's how you know whether to use the feedback and what to do with it. So to wrap this up, the big thing I would say is like, when you're getting critiqued, when you're getting feedback, you always want to appraise like, what's the person who's talking to me, like what are they going to get out of the feedback that they're giving me? Do they think they're helping me? The other thing is like, if they're straight up just like being mean or hurting your feelings, it doesn't matter what they say, screw them. But if you get the impression that that person is trying to help with the feedback, listen to it, but then look at where that person is coming from. Because you don't want to lose your internal compass about like what your work should be and what it should mean to you, just based on the whims of every single person who runs into your life. But on the other hand, you want to, as much feedback as you can get, it's going to help you establish like, when you're making work, is it doing what you think it's doing? Like, you're designing an identity system, is it actually something that people who design identity systems respect and think that you're good at? Or is it only what your teachers think is good, who may or may not actually be successful or good at the things that they do? So these are super important questions. So like, on the one hand, you want to be very cautious about feedback and about what you're doing with it. But on the other hand, you want to try and get as much of it as possible from a diverse range of people to understand how your work is communicating and how you're connecting with people. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to my channel. Also check out the MVA Studio on YouTube as well. We just started posting longer lectures from our classes, and you can also follow us on Twitter. We're at the MVA. On Instagram, it's at the MVA Studio. You can follow me on both. I'm MVA Joshua. Thanks for your time.